Welcome to Cincy Reformed. I'm Pastor Brandon, joined with Pastor Zac. We are pastors at Westside Reformed Church, a URC congregation in Cincinnati, Ohio. And today we wanted to speak about reflections on Synod. So the URCNA just held their Synod, and we wanted to talk about just some reflections. But before we do, Zac, maybe you could help our listeners who maybe they don't know what Synod means. Maybe they're in a denomination that doesn't have these kind of structures in place. Maybe you can introduce for our listener what that word means, how it functions, and all of that.
Sure, sounds good. Well, the word synod is a traditional term that's used in Christian denominations to refer to a very broad meeting with delegates from all across a nation or from all across the denomination. It's distinct from the local church assembly where elders meet together, or a regional assembly, which can be called a presbytery or a classis, or maybe if you're from a more episcopal governance, a diocese. The synod is the furthest reaching, or sometimes called a general synod. It's when people from all parts of the denomination gather together to deliberate, to make decisions that impact the entire denomination. So we held that in October. It's been delayed for a couple of years because of COVID stuff, but we convened in Buffalo, New York, and had some crazy wind from Lake Erie, and it was just, I was glad that we were inside for the most of it. That's for certain. But yeah, Brandon, I guess it was kind of your first experience there. You've been to some classis meetings before, of course, and you were examined at a classis meeting, and as was I, years ago. But your first time observing a synod, what were some of your initial thoughts as somebody who was seeing it for the first time?
Yeah, sure. So, coming out of a more Baptistic tradition, it was interesting to see Synod, because as a Baptist, I had been to some of the assemblies that the SBC had, but it was interesting in terms of some of the differences. Whereas when you're in an independent kind of autonomous church setting, those meetings don't really have direct authority over the church. I mean, we would vote on things and do things that was in cooperation, but there was nothing that was done that had like direct authority that had to like come back into my church or something like that. And a lot of the meetings in the more Baptistic settings were, it was more of an event. There was, various sermons, there were choirs, there were, a lot of things to kind of be entertained by. People would bring their whole families, and it was this kind of a big event. Yes, things were voted on, but in the meetings that I was in, there wasn't a ton of deliberation on the floor. There wasn't a lot of people standing up to speak for or against something being proposed. There wasn't much of that. And then so go to Synod, and that's happening the whole time. The whole time there's things being proposed, it's being debated, there's people standing up to the microphones, speaking for, against, or opposing amendments on the floor, and people countering it. And it was just an interesting back and forth that, and real big things were being brought up in Synod, things that had the potential to really kind of reshape even the way the Federation looks, or a way in which the Federation operates to some degree. And so that there were some things of magnitude that were being debated. And voices were welcomed, and microphones were stacked up with people, and Robert's Rules was in play. And even at times, people would challenge the chair, and it was just an interesting thing to see how the federation works, and that it's not just this, I don't know, kind of song and dance show, but it's something that is super important, something that has the potential to again reshape things. And so just the importance of Synod was I think evident when I was there. And I also appreciated how all the ministers who were delegates could stand up, could speak, and many of them felt that they had to speak at certain times to either oppose something or to commend something. And but the overall sense of Synod was that something of a great magnitude was happening, but also it was a unifying event as well. I mean, the ministers, even if they had different sides in a particular issue, were united, and everybody left united. And so it was just a great picture of unity, of ministers of the word, elders coming together to deliberate on extremely important matters for the federation. And it was just a stark contrast to a more independent association type of meeting that I was accustomed to.
If I can just jump in right here, I think maybe, I hope it's not getting too much in the weeds here, but maybe to mention a little bit more about what you just said, so people who've never seen something like this can maybe understand more of the inner workings. Mm-hmm. There is, in advance of the meeting, a large agenda that's created. Ours this year was about 350 pages, and so all the delegates are expected to have digested that before you arrive. And it's pretty intense stuff. I mean, it's very, there's a lot of information within those 350 pages, and each local church, for our General Synod, each church sends 2 delegates. Normally that's 1 minister and 1 elder that are then sent to the meeting. So we have about 125 churches, and so you could have up to 250 delegates. I think probably because of travel issues for some, our delegation was probably about 200 that were there, about 50-50 ministers and elders, ruling elders, that is. And then from that, the agenda that's created and all the committees that report and overtures that are sent to change things. From that, there are what's called advisory committees, and those are broken out to those advisory committees can digest the matter more in depth, and then bring a digested response to the plenary session, to the main floor. And so they've already done some of the work of deliberation, and they bring that to the general assembly, the plenary session, in order that the things can be officially voted on at that point. So it kind of goes back and forth between those advisory committees that then bring advice to the plenary session, and then the plenary session takes an action to either agree with the advisory committee or not, or to change some things that's brought forward. So yeah, a lot of back and forth there kind of occurs, and a lot of debate happens, not just in the advisory committee, but on the plenary session, as you said. Mm-hmm. So by the end of the week, you're there from Monday night until Friday about lunch or Friday afternoon. There's a lot that happens. It's a very busy week. You probably experienced that. It's I think some people think that you're just going on vacation. It's like, no, you start work at 8 in the morning and you're probably finishing at 9, maybe 9:30 or 10 at night. And it is grueling. It is absolutely exhausting.
Yeah. So Zach, you mentioned things are being debated. What were some issues maybe that were kind of brought up, debated at this particular synod?
Yeah, I mean, a few of the bigger points of debate were things like whether we would go to a more national synod approach of things, and I can maybe talk about that in a second here. Talked about how we are going to cooperate and to support missions, both home missions and foreign missions. Again, we can talk about that again in a second. I think a couple other big ticket items we were discussing, some how our appeals are being handled, and how if somebody has a complaint about a procedure or a decision that's made, how do we as a federation properly take that into consideration. to ensure that complaints are being heard correctly. So I think those are some of the bigger ones, maybe some more of the controversial ones. And then there are certainly some other things, maybe a little bit more minor in terms of how, like, small changes to our church order, small changes to how we, we have, websites, new websites going to be coming out in the future, just things like that that may be less impactful, but still important. So those are a few of the things. Where do you want me to start? Any place in particular?
Maybe you can explain this National Synod idea.
Yeah. So I guess we in the end voted not to go forward with a National Synod, but I think that there were helpful perspectives raised, and I think that it's pretty clear to people, it was probably clear by the end to the delegates, that eventually we're going to need to change how we do our General Synod meeting, because when you have 200 plus delegates in a room, it can be hard to have everyone's voices heard and have good, proper debate. It ends up becoming a thing where maybe only a handful of men are speaking at the microphones, and that the vast majority just simply don't. And if everyone were trying to do so, it would be impossible. So, in other words, when a denomination gets to a certain size, then you eventually need to get to a point where you begin to delegate not from the local church, but from a regional assembly instead. And so we voted in the end not to go forward with a National Synod approach. In other words, to have a Canadian Synod and a United States Synod, and then to have delegation toward a General Synod from that, or from the regional classis, but to basically to tailor back, or to scale back how large the General Synod ends up becoming. But it seems like that's probably going to happen in the future. Sure. So it was, I think, a helpful conversation to begin, even if it takes a few more synods to actually get to that point. I think it was important to bring that up. So
yeah, no, that's helpful. And we also talked a lot about how do we oversee missionaries, both foreign missionaries, home missionaries. What did the synod decide to do? Yeah,
we within our church polity, our ecclesiastical governance, we place a lot of emphasis on the authority of the local consistory, and that the consistory is the body that calls missionaries, sends missionaries, oversees worship, is responsible for things like church discipline. But then we also recognize that there's a necessity of cooperation, especially when we're thinking about the kind of foreign mission field. How then are we going to work together to make sure that our missionaries are taken care of, both financially, in terms of prayer, just general support, collaborating, coordinating together to make sure that a mission field is being taken care of, in order that we're not just sending out like one Lone Ranger missionary to plant one Lone Ranger church, and that they're just sitting there all by themselves for decades to come. So the questions are becoming, how do we as a federation ensure that we're not only planting churches, but we're planting really healthy churches, and that we're establishing regional assemblies and eventually denominations in overseas situations. And so that was, I think, really good conversations that took place. And so what ended up happening was that we are approaching things a little bit asymmetrically. So when we think about our home missions, I think that we're putting more of an emphasis on our classis, aka presbytery, to really support and to mobilize church planting and coordination and cooperation there. And so while we have a home missions committee for our whole federation, we don't have a home missions coordinator, at least not yet. But rather, we're trying to put the focus of we're trying to empower the regional assembly to really support and help and energize, catalyze church planting. But over in terms of our foreign missions, we have not only a foreign missions committee, but we also have a foreign missions coordinator. And so our current missions coordinator, Reverend Richard Bout, who has served our entire federation, both foreign and domestic, he is now being encouraged and he's been appointed to serve only the foreign fields, to really focus his energy on those foreign fields to encourage collaboration, coordination in those foreign mission contexts. So again, a little bit of an asymmetry there, but basically we decided as a federation that asymmetry is important because the foreign fields are in need of much more support, and that the foreign fields have a lot higher task in front of them to establish classes and denominations in due time. And so that's kind of where we went with that.
That's helpful. Yeah, I mean, one thing that that also stuck out to me this past synod was how careful people were being in terms of even language being used. And there were times where we were debating language about policies and how should it be worded, because we don't want to word it the wrong way, because if you word it one way, people could take it in a weird direction. Or they could imply something else that was not intended, and so there were some back and forth. It was a little bit tedious at times, but
It got really tedious.
it did get tedious. Should we use the word "the" or the word "this"? And but at the same time, it was important, and we need to get words right. Words matter, and words can lead us astray if we use the wrong ones. And so it was helpful to see the importance that was and the emphasis that was given, even as some of those days kind of dragged out and in tedious ways. But
some of the more senior delegates who were there, who've been to mini synods, said that our conversation about missions was the longest conversation, deliberation on one topic that they can remember, and that was by far the longest. So, but again, if you're going to talk about something that's going to be lengthy, I mean, missions is probably the right place to be putting your emphasis, right? So, that's fine by me if that's the thing that we're talking about the most.
Yeah, absolutely. So Zac, any closing reflections or anything that you would want our reader or listener rather to take away?
Well, I think that it was just, I think maybe this. It was really good because when you have men who've not seen each other for 4 years getting together, coming from different parts of the country, coming from different maybe theological points of emphasis. It's just good. It's good to get together. It's good to have some debate and deliberation. It's good to see that on one matter, maybe there are these different groups who are debating each other. But on the very next issue on the agenda, that the teams, if you can put it that way, have completely changed. And so then you're on the same side as people who you're just arguing against, and it's a very unifying thing. And I think that it does serve the well-being and the unity of our federation. And so I just appreciated that. I appreciated the fact that men were there who were not there with big egos and trying to make a name for themselves, but really trying to seek the long-term viability, the long-term purity and faithfulness, fidelity of United Reformed Churches, and committed to seeing the gospel go forward. And so, on the whole, I thought it was a great week and an encouraging one. So, yeah. What about you, Brandon? Any kind of closing reflections?
No, I mean, just to echo what you said, it was great to see people from churches that I've never visited, and from people from all over the country, even in Canada. We also had some people from sister denominations in like Latvia and South Africa, India, Australia. So it was just great to fellowship with those brothers and see how ministry in those other parts of the world rather are being done, and some of the challenges that they're facing that maybe we're not facing, and to pray for each other. I think it was a great experience.
Yeah, and on that point, yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I forgot we'd intended to speak on that, but. That's one of the key things I think that's really beautiful about a synod meeting, because you have delegates not only from your denomination, but from those that you have ecumenical ties to that come, and they actually are welcome to participate in the debate. They can't necessarily vote, but they're there to be an onlooker, to make sure that things are being conducted in faithfulness. They're there to give updates on their denominations. And then they can participate as they see fit to speak into our context from their vantage point as well. So when you have men from India who are talking about how within their rural village church planting that they've had people imprisoned and even martyred for the Christian faith. I mean, that just sobers you up right there, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And people from Australia and, like you said, Latvia. I mean, it was just a very moving time to hear people from across the world come to join us and to speak into our context and be part of those deliberations. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, really good. Well, thanks for joining us today on this episode of the Cincy Reformed Podcast. We hope it's been encouraging for you as well. We will invite you to come and join us if you're in the Cincinnati area at Westside Reformed Church. You can find us at westsidereformed.org. And if you appreciated this episode, give us a 5-star review and listen to our other episodes. You can find on our podcast, on our podcast feed, or at cincyreformed.org. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.